Okay, welcome everybody. This is going to be a video on one of my favorite strategies for the past several leagues, and that is the Expedition Logbook Sun to Scythe pipeline, where we are going to be running a large number of Knights of the Sun logbooks, and we are going to be using the Burial Medallions and Knights of the Sun artifacts that we get from those logbooks to purchase from Dannig's window, potentially Astragali, depends on their price this league, but certainly other logbooks that we come across, Exotic Coinage, the Tujen reroll currency, and Black Scythe artifacts. From there, we are going to use Tujen's window as normal to reroll with the coinage and purchase currency with the artifacts. From there, we will see whether we have any of one or the other left over, and whether we maybe want to run a few Black Scythe logbooks to round out the currency in any way. So, step one of this strategy is to purchase a bunch of logbooks. I have done so. They cost, at the moment, they're around 70 chaos. I think I got these maybe for 65 chaos each, somewhere in there. They're hovering around there. That's much better than it's been in previous leagues, where they've been 90, 100, 105. So feeling pretty good about that. Now that we've got these logbooks, the next thing we're going to do is use Blessed Orbs on them, attempting to change. These are all implicit modifiers on here. We are going to keep an eye on the Knights of the Sun implicit modifiers, and we're mostly going to be trying to get the two values above 30%. There are some of these rolls that go up to 50. We'll keep an eye on that. There are some of them that are things like some additional chests that only go up to 16 or 20. We obviously take that into account, but we want each of the rolls to be somewhere in the 75th or 80th percentile of goodness for that roll, whatever it is. And once we've got those to a good place, we throw Orbs of Alchemy at these, just not looking for any particular stats. Get them to be rare, that's all. Because the step after that is we're going to acquire a bunch of Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnids, which I have also done. And the important thing with acquiring these Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnids for the split recipe, our goal, now that we've used the Blessed Orbs to change the implicit modifiers on the Knights of the Sun logbooks, we basically get 2-for-1 value on the Blessed Orbs because the logbooks, when you split them in two, retain whatever implicit values were on the original. So the important thing before you purchase the Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnids is you need to check what the price of the Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnid is and what the price of the logbook is. As long as the Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnid is within, say, 5 chaos above the price of a logbook, it's almost certainly worth it to do the splitting yourself. The reason for that is, number one, you get to save on all of the Blessed Orbs that you would spend on double the number of logbooks. You don't have to spend all of those. And then the second reason is it's just a hassle to find people with a lot of logbooks. It's typically easier to find people with a large number of split beasts. I first bought 10 Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnids, and then it turned out that if I just waited another 20 minutes, somebody got on Discord who had hundreds of them, and so I bought the rest of them. I have a total of 40 logbooks, and right here we have 36 Phenomenal-Plagued Arachnids. I already had 4 captured from my previous strategy. So, next up, we are going to go to the menagerie, and we are going to use these split beasts on our 40 logbooks to make them 80. Before we can split them, we have to use Blessed Orbs on each of them to improve their implicit modifiers. I'm going to speed up the video for this part and do my audio as a voiceover since the blessing and splitting process is pretty repetitive to watch. Now, when we split the logbook, both copies will have the original implicit numbers, whatever you roll right now. So now is the time to do this part, to save money on Blessed Orbs. During the blessing process, there are a couple of general rules to follow. Most of the implicits that you're going to find on logbooks have rolls that vary between 10 and 40%. Not universally, we'll talk about some of the exceptions, but most of them. A logbook is going to have either 2 or 3 implicit modifiers per mission, usually 2 modifiers, and the implicit modifiers are totally dedicated and confined to whichever mission you choose to run. And in our case, we're going to be running only the Knights of the Sun mission. So only pay attention to the 2 or 3 implicits that are above the Knights of the Sun mission. You can ignore the others. In the most common scenario, where you have 2 desirable implicits varying between 10 and 40, your goal is to use Blessed Orbs on those which randomize the values until both mods are somewhere in their 30s. Ideally, they would be above 35 each, but we don't want to waste too many Blessed Orbs here. You're going to have to play it by ear a little bit. So, if you end up with one that's like 38 and 31, you're good to stop there. That's fine, unless one of them is very, very important in your judgment. And speaking of which, not every implicit is created equal. So, for example, the increased monster markers implicit is pretty mediocre. So if that's your second implicit and you get your first one to a good place, don't worry about it. You don't need to be as strict about that monster marker implicit. It does not need to go through the roof to be effective. It's actually not a terribly effective one to begin with. Then there's an implicit for an increased number of chests in the logbook area, and that one only goes up to 16. It's not a percent, it's a raw, like it's actually adding an individual chest per number. And for that one, as long as I'm north of 10 or so, I feel good about that, if my other mod is doing well. Then there's a mod that's called Contains an Additional Underground Area, and that implicit has no rolls at all. It's static and constant. You're just going to get one additional underground area, which is good. I mean, that's not a bad thing. The underground areas usually have a lot of chests in them, but you can't change it, so you can actually just focus on rolling your one implicit if you get that one. A couple of the explosion-related mods, so the ones for explosion range between your kind of marker spots and the radius of the explosion itself, those go up to 50 instead of 40. And for those ones, I try to basically follow the same rules before, but trying to get them into the low 40s instead of the low 30s. Same idea, though. If I have one mod that goes up to 50 and one goes up to 40, I'm just shooting for the one to get into the 40s and the one to get into the 30s. That's it. And if you get lucky, they'll be at the high end of those. There's also an implicit that reads, excavated chests have X% chance to contain twice as many items, and it only rolls from 5 to 20. You can't get higher than a 20% chance to duplicate the chest items. You do want to get this one as close to 20 as possible. Many of the chests you're going to be opening, you're not going to target any chest that has crappy stuff in it. You're really going to be shooting for like the currency ones, and so make sure that you get that one as close to 20 as possible. Then once you've got all the original logbooks that you bought blessed up to your satisfaction, you can take advantage of that by then moving on to the splitting process. During the blessing process, for me, when I did these, I averaged just under 3.5 blessed orbs per logbook. Several of them had good natural rolls and required 0 blessed orbs, and then I got several that just hit a good roll in a single orb. But then on the other end, some went above like 6 or 7 if it was being stubborn, but I would eventually call it. I wasn't going to do it forever and waste a bunch of currency, so somewhere around 3 or 4 was the most common number of orbs I had to use. Once that process is done, we can move on to the actual splitting process. Unfortunately, during this session, I made the error that I tell everyone not to make. I started splitting before I had blessed the logbooks, and I got through half of them before I realized my error. So while I wound up using 213 blessed orbs across the whole process, I could have ended up using only around like 140 if I had done it properly. So let my mistake be your lesson. Bless your logbooks, then split them. So at the end, when we talk about profit, I will include versions with and without this screw up to show whether there is any market difference. I don't think there will be, but we will check. I ended up spending just over 100 chaos worth of blessed orbs on this step, but it could have been under 75 chaos orbs if I remembered to bless in the proper order. So, a difference of maybe 25 chaos orbs spread over what's going to be 80 logbooks, not likely to make too much of a difference, but hey, there's no reason to throw money away if you don't have to, right? So I recommend blessing them first. Then you get to the actual splitting process, and this is pretty zen, in my opinion. So once you ensure that all your logbooks are rare by using an alchemy or regal orb on them, the exact mods don't matter because we're going to get rid of them anyways. Once they're rare, you open your bestiary, right-click all of your Phenuma-plagued arachnid objects. You'll have to hit I on your keyboard to open up your inventory at the same time as your bestiary, by the way. So right-click them to get your Phenuma-plagued arachnids into your bestiary, and then you do 40 fights. Each time, you're going to pop in a new logbook, paste the word split into the search box to highlight the proper craft, and then run it. Realistically, this fight, if you're ready for logbooks, you can use this as a barometer. Like, if this fight is difficult for you, if you die at some of these, you might want to abort. This is pretty well on the low end of difficulty compared to the logbooks that you're going to be running. So for me, it was quite easy. I was able to phase each of these guys in like 10 or 15 seconds, so that even with taking things out of the stash and taking things on and off of the blood altar and all that stuff, I was done in under 15 minutes with splitting all 40 into 80 logbooks. So not a terribly tedious part of this process, and this way you don't have to go and search out even more Knights of the Sun logbooks. So at this point, we get the very tedious part of the process. The splitting part wasn't tedious, but this is. We are going to alch and scour these until you get a set of mods where the logbook's quantity is above 60%, and we also need to make sure it's mods that aren't breaking our build. And unfortunately, we do have to be pretty cautious with which mods we take here, because if and when we inevitably run across the Olroth boss fight, which happens around 1 in every 5 or 6 logbooks, it just happens randomly. If you get too many damaging mods for that boss fight, it can make it virtually impossible. In previous leagues, I've definitely had a few logbooks that I bricked the Olroth fight, which you really don't want to do. He drops a ton of artifacts and reroll currency. He's actually a big part of your profits. You want to make sure that you don't brick the fight. There's also, for that fight, Consecrated Ground, in my experience, really makes that fight terrible. Consecrated Ground, he's regenerating a lot of life. So I do try to avoid that unless absolutely necessary to take it. Now, for rolling the logbooks, I recommend using a regex code, at least for the quantity piece. So I'll put the regex code in the description of the video that I used, and all that does is it highlights it in your stash if the logbook is above 60 quantity, if you use this little string of characters. So at least you can then immediately know which ones to check for the other mods. There are ways to use a regex to also check for individual mods, but because I was kind of using a soft touch here, I didn't have a hard and fast rule about which ones I was throwing out. I looked at each one individually to see, okay, can this combination of mods be too deadly for me, or can I do it? So use a regex to at least highlight the high quantity ones. If they're good, put them off to the side. If either the high quantity ones are bad or it's just not a high quantity logbook, it didn't get highlighted, then you just scour it and start over. And your group of scourable logbooks will get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go, constantly taking out the ones that roll well. This is tedious. This was probably half of my total setup time. It ended up taking me nearly an hour to do all of the setup, and this was like 30 minutes of it right here. A lot of clicking, but it's important, getting good quantity without having bricked mods. This is big. You will thank yourself later. You're adding, under 30 seconds per logbook to do this when you think about it that way. Very, very much worth it. And just some quick numbers here. I ended up using, between Scours, Binding Orbs, and Alchs, it was a total of 158 chaos worth of currency, and the vast majority of that, so 120 out of 158, was based on Scouring Orbs. Alchemy Orbs and Binding Orbs are very cheap, and Scouring Orbs are not. You use a lot more Scouring Orbs in crafting, and so, yeah, vast majority of that is Scours, so you really don't want to have to scour too many times. But again, we ended up adding another couple of chaos each to the cost of each logbook, and we were paying 65 or 70 chaos for each logbook. So, spending a couple more to guarantee that we get a reasonable set of mods, that is very much worth it. So that brings us to the end of the rolling process. Again, from beginning to end, from purchasing, blessing, splitting, and rolling, took about an hour. And now we get to put that behind us and dive into the fun part, running some logbooks. Running the logbooks is not difficult for a good build, but there are some pointers to keep in mind. First, for goodness sake, keep half an eye on which remnants you're selecting. These are the blue and silver dots on the minimap that come with a drawback and a benefit. Nearly every build in the game has some mod that will brick it, from damage immunities to cannot evade enemy attacks to can't crit against enemies, like for a cast on crit build. And then when you're laying your explosive down, practice getting the green circle to encompass as much as possible, keeping in mind that it's going to have the widest straight line between 2 points centered on the middle of the circle. You can tell which objects are going to be blown up by the explosion because they will light up in green. Practice moving that circle on and off an object to get a feel for what they look like when lit up, so that you can eventually start doing this instinctively. Next tip, counterintuitive as it may seem, I have found better success and more profit per hour not obsessing over pre-running the whole area looking for the best mods before I lay out my explosives. At most, I might do a quick circle around the starting area to see if anything good is nearby. And good here I would define as monster item quantity, runic monsters duplicated, and keep in mind that one is actually going to be on the top line of the remnant in darker blue, since technically duplicated runic monsters is considered a drawback, but for us it's an amazing booster for reroll currencies. And then just any artifact related mods are typically pretty good. Beyond that though, it's more efficient to just eyeball the minimap and quickly start moving towards clusters of currency and artifact chests, bonus if there are a bunch of remnants nearby. Now, runic monsters, the larger skulls on spikes sticking out of the ground, they don't appear on the minimap, but they're fairly common. So try to path in such a way that you're picking up at least one on nearly every explosion point. Just kind of look ahead a half a screen and see which direction you'll want to turn to pick up one or two of those per explosion. Now, there is a boss icon, a big skull that appears on the minimap, unlike the runic monsters. And if this big skull appears on your minimap, try to organize your explosion chain so that you've taken a lot of remnants before you get to the boss. There is, in fact, a hidden quantity boost based for the boss based on the number of remnants affecting them when you blow it up. I would say just don't go overboard. I personally have occasionally bricked an Olroth boss fight by biting off more than I can chew with crit modifiers and elemental damage penetration modifiers and all that stuff. But speaking of Olroth, now is a good time to mention his fight, since it is a major part of our profits here. We want to be able to win this fight because he drops a lot of reroll currency. So as boss fights go, it's fairly straightforward. It's a 3-phase fight, and it mostly consists of standard telegraphed sword attacks by the boss, and it's also got a laser that fires at you from the wall. You do want to avoid that. It inflicts damage over time effect on you, so just try to dodge out of the way of that, but you can usually flask through it if you happen to get hit. Now, during the first phase, in theory, he can perform his ultimate move. I've seen it happen very occasionally. His ultimate move is called Wasteland. But in my experience, if you've got reasonable DPS and you haven't taken too many of the monster's defensive modifiers on your remnants, I usually make it out of phase 1 without ever seeing that ultimate move. Maybe once or twice I've seen it. Now, when it does show up, you're going to know what this move is because he's going to just shout the word Wasteland very loudly, and he's going to levitate his sword in front of him. It levitates for about a second, and then he slams it down into the ground, and it creates a large cone area of effect in front of him, which is a one-shot for every build that I've ever taken into the fight. Maybe there's some builds that can survive it, like the Shaper Slam, but I've never survived that hit. So the best way to manage it is to just get behind him. As long as you're more than a character's width behind him, you're totally safe. And even, if you're forced to be in front of him, if there's just no way to get behind him safely, just make sure that you are more than half the arena away from him, because it is a very large AoE. Now, once you get his HP to 0 for phase 1, he's going to enter sort of a phase transition period where he's invulnerable and he summons trash mobs from a portal that's going to pop up on the left side of the arena. As he does this, a crystal is going to rise up at the top of the arena. Now, beware this crystal. It sticks around for the rest of the fight, and it can be a killer for inexperienced players. It's got this massive degen amount, but the radius of it is small to medium, so just don't get too close to that crystal, and you'll certainly know when you do because your health will start skyrocketing down, or rocketing downwards, I should say. And really, it's just there as a tactics check. It wants to make sure that you're aware of it. And it kind of restricts movement in the arena. So especially when the boss is going to perform that wasteland maneuver, it restricts further the places where you can go to hide from it. Now, near the end of this transitional period between phases, a pair of expeditional explosives will appear on the screen with little icons. It's like a quick time mini game, little icons that say click here to arm the explosive, and then once you've armed it, it'll say click here to detonate the explosive. It doesn't matter which of the two you arm, you can just pick whichever one is closer to you. I think they just give you two to make it so that you're not totally boxed in on the area that you've got to stand, because once you detonate one of them, that will make Olroth vulnerable to damage again, and this is the beginning of phase 2. At this point, the Wasteland ultimate move is going to come much more frequently now. He's got some other moves that come more frequently too, but they're not nearly as deadly as Wasteland. So just be on the lookout for it. And once you get his health down to 0 again, the exact same phasing process is going to take place. No mechanical differences here, but a second crystal will appear now at the bottom of the screen to further restrict movement. You've got one at the top and now one at the bottom. Another set of explosives is going to come up just like before, and you will click one of them 2 times, just like last time, and this will bring you to phase 3. Once you enter phase 3, it's nearly over, and from what I can tell, it's identical to phase 2. Just watch out for Wasteland again, kite around him. If your build is vulnerable to his dashing attack, make sure that you dash to the side or through him when he's lining up his dash attack. And then he'll get down to 0 again and drop a fat stack of Burial Medallions and artifacts when he dies. Also, drops worth noting, check the base rolls. Hold your Alt key to check for base rolls on any item level 85 ward gear that he drops, because if it rolls in the top percentile, especially if it rolls with the top possible base roll of the defensive stat on helm, boots, gloves, that can actually sell for quite a bit. And then the other thing to watch out for, which is going to happen much less frequently, is if he drops a unique flask. I think it's called Olroth's Resolve, and this is kind of the high roll drop. It's very nice. It's worth a few divines. I dropped one of them over the course of my 80 logbooks, and my 80 logbooks included 15 Olroth encounters. So I think you can safely say it's somewhere between a 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 drop on that. But it is very nice when you do get it. Sell for a few divines. So that brings us to the end of the boss fight. So when all is said and done, the logbooks are over. We had a lot of currency, but then again, we invested a lot of currency. So that's really not saying much. We've got to calculate it out and figure out whether it was worth it or not. As anticipated, as I said earlier in the video, the difference between splitting or blessing first, whether you did it in the right order or not, it was very minuscule. So let's take a look at that on the profit page here. But it still is worth doing in the right order. It saves you a bit of currency. There is no sense in throwing the currency away. But with that said, it didn't have a noticeable impact on these results. As we dive into the data here, you can kind of see, or you'll see as we go, why I call this a pipeline strategy. By following these multiple steps, you're going to literally make several times more currency than you would if you just followed that first step of running the logbooks and then selling whatever you find. Now, the reason for this, and the key to all of it, is that the artifacts themselves constitute a massive part of your profit, but you can't sell them. In Expedition League 3.15, you could sell the artifacts, but no more. If you want to profit from them, you have to use them. So to use the artifacts, you've got to spend your reroll currency. And I fully understand that can feel bad. If you're newer to this, you haven't had the experience of doing it before, it feels like you're just spending your hard-won reroll currency that you could have just sold right away for an easy profit. Why am I going to spend time sitting at a vendor window spending my money when I should be just selling it and going back to logbooks. But let me promise you, it is not worth it to sell right away, and I want to show you the math on that. So what we're looking at now, this sheet, is the 7 hours that it took me to run the logbooks, and what would it look like if I just sold all of my drops, including the burial medallions. Well, the math works out that I only would have wound up making 1.5 divines per hour after you subtract the investment. I mean, that's pathetic. That's nothing. In one of my previous videos, we got twice that amount of profit with a no investment mapping strategy. And in that video, I said even that wasn't a great strategy to get, 3 divines an hour. So if and when people complain that they can't profit off of logbooks, I feel like maybe in some of those cases, this is why, because they're just running the logbooks and then selling what they get from the logbooks without taking it to the next step. So what does it look like when we take it to the next step? Well, when we turn in those burial medallions at the Dannig window, this is what it looks like. I took about 45 minutes and turned them in and then subtracted their value from the profit. So you can see here the Exilence value used to include all of the burial medallions. It's gone way down now because we have spent those burial medallions. So just to compare to the previous, was at 7,600. It's gone way down to 2,900 now. But at the Dannig window, we took most Astragalis. Occasionally, if we were low on a certain type of currency and the Astragali cost that currency, we wouldn't take it there. But most of the time, we took Astragali. And certainly if their price goes up this league, you'll definitely want to take them. I took all exotic coinage and all logbooks. As well as this, I took any black scythe artifact that was offered in the lower portion of the window, where the discounts are, at 0.5 or 0.6 of a turn-in ratio. So you spend 0.6 of your Dannig artifacts to get one full Tujen artifact. So at a rate of 0.5 or 0.6, at those deals, I would buy any black scythe currency. On top of that, any grand or exceptional deals, so the kind of sword-looking objects and the kind of T-bone shaped objects, those are rare enough. They don't come up often in the discount window. I will buy those at any discount ratio. And in fact, once I get to the end and I've reached the end of one type of artifact, typically what happens is I've got a bunch of the sword-shaped ones left over, and I can just buy as many of those as I want at a 1-to-1 ratio, because they seem to be the one where you get the most of them and get the fewest opportunities to trade them in. So I will sometimes buy those at a 1-to-1. And if you look at the profits from doing that, the difference is stark. And this is driven in large part by the black Scythe logbooks that we were able to find. We got a bunch of them. And by the Knights of the Sun logbooks, which if you take just the normal Knights of the Sun logbooks, and then on top of that, several of them rolled with the Olroth modifier. These are worth a lot more when you can guarantee that Olroth is going to be there dropping all those burial medallions and artifacts, and potentially even the flask. So I've added in the difference between an Olroth logbook and a normal Knights of the Sun logbook, which you can just see in the implicit modifiers on the logbook. And then on top of that, the other big winner, the biggest of all, was the Exotic Coinage for Tujen. And with this, we rocket up to more than twice what we had before. We're at 3.7 divines per hour. After spending not even a full additional hour, that 3.7 is averaged across the entire now 7.8 hours. So just spending those 45 minutes at the window suddenly more than doubled our profits. That's enormous. I can't understate how important, or I can't overstate rather, how important that is. So should we stop here, or should we keep going? You know what I'm going to say. We should keep going, and instead of selling these exotic coinage that are worth around 4,200 chaos orbs here, let's turn them in at the Tujen window and see what we get then. As for the Tujen strategy, As a rule, try not to buy anything that's worth less than a Chaos Orb in whatever stack you're buying, unless you're using a lot of that thing yourself. So I will buy Blessed Orbs and Scouring Orbs regardless of their value because I use a ton of them in this strategy. So I buy those every time they come up. The other rule is try not to spend more expensive, rarer artifacts, the higher tier ones, on lower tier type items. So for instance, even if a stack of 10 alteration orbs is worth around a chaos, it probably isn't worth spending grand artifacts on them, the sword type, whereas it may very well be worth spending the lesser artifacts on them, which the lesser artifacts are often the last ones to run out. You are not going to get a choice of what to spend on an item in a given window. So the type of artifact used to buy an item can actually change from window to window and even within the same window. Plenty of times I'll buy fusings for greater artifacts in one window and then a few more for lesser artifacts in the same window. So the screen is approximately organized by what type of artifacts the items cost, with items costing the rarest types of artifacts up towards the upper left, and the least rare types of artifacts towards the lower right and in the right-hand column. And if you kind of follow those general rules, buy things that are very liquid on Pewee Ninja, things that have a high trade rate. You know, don't go for the rare stuff. Scarabs are an easy buy. Conqueror maps, easy buy. Any kind of Delve Resonator, easy buy. Fossils, check them. Things like scorched fossils, frigid fossils are probably not worth buying, but anything that's worth around a chaos per fossil, that's definitely worth buying, and there are more like that this league than in some previous leagues. So keep an eye on the excellence price. As you get used to this process, it's just going to become very automatic for you. At the beginning, I was checking lots of things. You know, a couple leagues ago when I started doing this, I would check the price on things a lot. So this may take you a little bit longer as you do that, but as you get accustomed to it, it's going to take you less and less time as you go. And at this point, I can whip through the window very easily. You know, I went through hundreds of reroll windows in those couple hours that I spent on this process. So at this point, you've got a choice. You've got a lot of exotic coinage reroll currency left, but you're out of artifacts. You could either simply sell the remaining coinage, or you could take some of the Black Scythe logbooks that you ran or that you got from Dannig, run them yourself, maybe 5 or 10 of them, and use that to make up some of the difference in artifacts. This is kind of a toss-up to me. I don't really know which is worth more. You know, maybe if somebody wants to do an experiment on that one. For me, I've kind of reached the end of my rope there, and for the most part, I might run 4 or 5 logbooks at most, but oftentimes I'll just sell the reroll currency at this point. So let's talk about what we're getting from the Tujen window. So just a ton of raw currency. We've got fusing orbs, alteration orbs, some exalted orbs, and of course, importantly, divine orbs, big driver of the profit right there. We've got scarabs, we've got heist gear. There are abyss jewels, which I've estimated that I might be able to sell maybe around 100 chaos worth of those. I'm hoping that it's more. I picked up ones that had important stats like flat added minion damage, maximum life, phasing, things like that in good combinations. And so it's hard to tell you exactly what to look for there, but from my eye, I think I can estimate selling for at least 100 chaos there and hopefully more. Breach rings sell in bulk at 1.5 chaos each, so between what I was finding out in the logbooks themselves plus what I was able to get from the Tujen window, which was a bunch, you add those all together, you get a little bit of money right there. But the Tujen excellence window, keep in mind, this line right here is just the Tujen excellence window alone. I had a separate window for what I was getting from Tujen. The logbook excellence window is right here. Now you may notice a slight discrepancy. The value has crept up a little bit on that since the previous sheet, and that's because the price of the divine orb has actually been rising to a large degree this week, and that's hard to account for in the numbers, so I just kind of kept them as they were at the time that I took the recording. You know, I could only work with what I had. But when you take all of that together, we're still subtracting the same old cost. All we've added here is time. And we've only been spending things that we acquired throughout the process, the Dannig coins and the Tujen coins and the artifacts. And with that, we wind up with a whopping 85 divines netted after you subtract the cost. So we had nearly 100 gross divine orbs worth of value, and this winds up being, once you average it out over the 10 or so hours, it's 10.3 hours it took all told, around 8.3 divines per hour. You could very easily round that down to as low as like 7 or 7.5 if you said, well, I'm not sure I'll be able to sell everything that I got. I did set a reasonably strict cutoff in my Exilence window. This is consisting of things that you can sell. Things like Guardian maps, orbs of fusing, orbs of alteration, chaos orbs. Things are going to go pretty quickly, scarabs. So I don't think that I was unfair with this. I think what would be fair to say is the immediate liquidated profit that you could get in minutes is probably something like 6 or 7 divines an hour, and then the rest of it is stuff that when you get desperate, when you're trying to squeak out that last few divines to buy whatever piece of gear, that you can find that stuff in your stash tab. But what the math says, and again, I was fairly strict with my Exilence filter, is that it was 8.3 divines per hour, which has again more than doubled from where we were if we had stopped earlier. So this looks to me like the best of the best. If you do this efficiently, so that 10.3 hours was when I was actively running things, when I was in-game. Obviously, I did it in several sessions, but as long as I was in-game working on this, whether I was doing the logbook or rolling the vendor window, I did track that time, so it was a little over 10 hours of in-game time. And yeah, it comes out very efficient on the profit, and I do recommend it. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions about the strategy or any comments on it, but hopefully you can see why this has been one of my favorites for a while now. So try it out. Take it easy, everybody.